sort of?
We can.
Okay, cool.
If you could start by sharing, by starting the presentation, that would be great as well.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So I'll try to keep it fast. I think I have the shortest presentation. So yeah, I'll try to get us close to the, finishing on time. So I'm working on a project to digitize and make publicly available a data set created in collaboration with Paul Van Dyke from British East India Company ship's logs, China factory records, and the wills, the probate records of East India Company personnel who were working and living in China in Guangzhou. The data include information about servants, so people called servants, people who were bonded, and enslaved people who were all working in Canton or who were traveling on East India Company vessels across the Indian Ocean, either departing from China or their destination was China. And I'm also looking at the demographics, the conditions of their labor, the roles that they were playing in supporting Britain's empire in the Indian Ocean world. And my hope is to add a crucial missing piece to the study and digital representation of servitude and slavery that is tended to focus on the Atlantic, I mean, as we all know, but more recently on the Western Indian Ocean and also the Dutch, as we see lots of people talking about the Dutch. So it's a bit different to talk about the British. Okay. Oops. Did that work? Why am I not able to? Okay, there we go. Thus far, the vast majority of digital humanities projects that have emerged over the last decade or two take the Atlantic slave trade as their subject of inquiry and representation. And that is, of course, mirroring the general trend in the scholarship over the last many, many decades. So just to give you an example of what I mean, of course, we all are very familiar with this particular database, but if you were to look at Bond's Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies hosts a website which very neatly compiles like what they think, you know, they try to be as comprehensive as possible, all the major websites and digital projects on slavery that are extant. And I've highlighted in red the one that deals with Indian Ocean, but everything else is Atlantic. So I think that's, I mean, that really tells you something. And here's another page. So it's, yeah, everything in white is Atlantic. So we've got basically one-ish. Eventually, there will be more. And this list doesn't include the most recent digital humanities projects that are coming out on the Caribbean. Now that I'm over here in this sort of in Scandinavia, I found out about some projects that are coming out of University of Uppsala. There's one actually coming out of University, but all focused on the Caribbean. Things are beginning to change, obviously, just as there's obviously been, you know, explosion of scholarship on Indian Ocean slavery. And so the digital humanities part is sort of catching up. And as many of you probably know, sorry, that's just a nice image of the one of the Caribbean. This is actually supposed to go live like in a couple of days on the Swedish Caribbean. And there'll be lots of material on slavery there. As many of you probably know, Jane Hooper just announced on slavevoyages.org back in late February that they've received a grant to expand Slave Voyages database and the website coverage to include data that they and many others have gathered over the last few decades on slave trading in the Indian Ocean. So that's a very significant development in terms of giving Indian Ocean world slavery a digital presence. The other major digital project with respect to slavery, hold on a second, there we go, is the Exploring Slave Trade in Asia project, which sort of emerged in around 2016, comes out of the Netherlands, headed by Matthias van Rossum, and is currently designed for the compilation of what they call sort of meso-level data on the slave trade, meaning data pertaining to individual voyages or groups of enslaved people rather than to particular enslaved individuals. And the project is mainly based on the Dutch sources, the VOC, and to a lesser degree, some French sources. So the team came out with something just a couple of months, or actually a couple of weeks ago, talking about sort of where they're at in the project. So 96% of all the voyages in their data set have their origins mostly in the VOC or in the French EICs. And also there's a kind of bias towards Madagascar and the Mascarene Islands. According to the team at the ESTA, they intend to reconstruct the study of Asian slavery, the Asian slave trade as part of a larger global flow of slave trade in a comparative way. And they aim to provide the field with detailed, systematic, and quantifiable figures and reconstructions for the slave trade. Instead of merely rough estimates, they want to come up with like pretty hard numbers. And so they are claiming right now that about at least 392,000 to 415,000 enslaved people can be identified directly or indirectly in their records. And they've also estimated that 660,000 to over 1 million people who were enslaved were transported to Dutch settlements. Now, what I'm trying to do, I'm sorry, is with my own project, what I'm calling at this point, I mean, the names have been changing, but I'm calling it now Benjamin of Batavia's World, is a little bit different from what is going on with the slavevoyages.org and ESTA in a couple of ways. First, my source space is different. I'm looking at EIC ship logs, personnel's like probate records, that are not typically associated with slavery. And that's because the ships I'm looking at are not slave ships. So that's another big difference. These aren't slave voyages, and yet slaves on these ships. So that's a really important distinction. Second, my research is geographically different, right? I'm really focused on the eastern part of, I mean, I'm always wondering if I get included in this conference on Indian Ocean, because I'm not sure if China counts, but it seems like I've been twice now at McGill, and I think I've been included. So, okay, so South China Sea seems to count. So, but yeah, there hasn't really been a whole ton of work done on the eastern side of things. Of the Indian Ocean. There was a great monograph that came out in 2018 by Lucio de Souza, Portuguese slave trade in early modern Japan, merchants, Jesuits, and Japanese, Chinese, and Korean slaves. Very, very forensic level detail, using all kinds of interesting sources, including Inquisition records to trace slaves in East Asia. But still, this is a part of the Indian Ocean that doesn't usually get much attention. And the third thing is that I am actually not as interested in the quantitative side of things. First of all, that's because I really can't fixate on that, because my sources are never going to give me any kind of confidence, I think, in estimating numbers. So I think I kind of have to, you know, I can guesstimate, but I don't think I can't really do what the Van Rossum's team is doing. But I can do qualitative research here. And my leanings as a historian tend to be biographical and more narrative based anyhow. So now one of my concerns, you know, about creating a digital work with a data set and a database like this relates, of course, to the historical and ethical issues around sticking too closely to the structures and schemas of the archives, which were, of course, created by enslavers, by people in power, the profiteers of the trade in human beings. And then, of course, reproducing those schemas, recreating the violence of these archives, reinforcing the commodification of the enslaved, and removing the possibility of agency for these people in history. These indeed have been criticisms rightfully leveled at earlier digitization projects. And as Stephanie Smallwood, author of Saltwater Slavery, has shown us, in the Atlantic world, the Middle Passage was not only one of the largest or the largest forced migration in human history, but it was a process that involved the commodification of human beings. And, you know, we kind of recreate that commodification if we stick too closely to just purely quantitative ways of understanding the story, basically. So by staying at that meso level, focusing on the voyages, and by just sort of counting and thinking of enslaved human beings in terms of the numbers, I think we lose something. Now, that's not to say that these projects aren't incredibly valuable. I mean, they're amazing. I use slavevoyages.org all the time when I teach. I find it incredible and profound. But I think we can do more. I mean, people know that they are moving. The Atlantic historians are certainly moving beyond the numbers now. And if you look at the digital projects that have exploded on that Bond website, many of them are about lives, about experiences, about narratives. A lot of the titles include that, right? So that's been the response in the Atlantic world. And I'm basically going to try to do that for the Indian Ocean side. So in short, I guess I would say, oh, we need a microhistorical approach to the Indian Ocean world slavery. How do you do that? Okay, so practically speaking, well, we can focus not only on the voyages themselves, but on the people who were on these ships, right? And this requires prosopographical and needle in the hay forensic style research, which has actually been facilitated by the digital turn in humanities. With mass scale digitization of archives, it's actually possible to do this kind of work. And in the case of the sources that I'm using for my project, it might be more possible to do this kind of deep dive research than with some of the Atlantic trade records or even the Dutch records, because of the way that servants and slaves are documented in the British sources, in the British East India Company sources. Basically, what I'd like to do is just show you, just to give you a very, I spend 2 minutes showing you kind of what I'm working on right now. So I'm just demoing like what this database or what this kind of could look like. And I'm using software called Scalar, which is open, not just open access, but open source. It kind of facilitates showing a kind of a narrative and a kind of a multimedia way of using storytelling. And I'm embedding within Scalar right now, I'm using Night Labs, also free software, their timelines, their story maps. So let me just see if I can show you that now. It's super early days for this material. Okay. Can you see my screen? I hope you can see. Philip, can you see it?
No, I can still only see your PowerPoint presentation. Did
Just
you
my PowerPoint
share the whole screen, or did you share the window?
Yeah, let me go back to share. Here, I gotta share Google Chrome. It's been a while since I've done this. All right, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, so this is Scalar. It's a really cool piece of software. Basically, yeah, so this is the idea. So you kind of enter with Benjamin of Batavia, who is one person that I've chosen, who I would like to write actually a book about, as an example. So you kind of, when you enter this database, you land at his story first. And then you can kind of, click and scroll through and learn about the life of this particular enslaved individual. I have lots of text and images, obviously, but then got a nice little timeline of his life, which you can sort of go through and see, his personal trajectory. And so what I'm imagining is like a number of these together, but also I'll show you my data. I'm also working on a database which doesn't currently exist exactly, but is going to require a lot of work. Here, let me show you the data. So basically, this is the data upon which the database would be based. And, so you've got, so basically, these are all different ships going back and forth from China. And then I've kind of created this metadata to, eventually help people sort through it. But the year, the point of departure, the destination, the name of the ship, and also the name of the servant or slave who was on that ship. So what's nice is we do get quite a few names here, not every time, and then we get also, in addition to the names of the individuals who are being, sent across, the ocean. They're traveling though. So what's unique, I think, about my sources perhaps is they're traveling with their enslaver, employer. And I don't know whether, some of it's not clear who's a servant and who's a slave. So that's or what, we can talk a lot about categorization and language and of course, like the cross-cultural dimensions of this. But what this, and okay, so just, I'm going to come back to that point in a second, but we've got physical descriptors, we've got occupational descriptors. Sometimes they're just called servants, but sometimes we know they're a cook or they're a menial servant or laborer. There's all kinds of nurses, things like this. So sometimes we have descriptions of, gender, and also like where they originate, where they're from. Sometimes they're referred to as a native, but sometimes they're referred to as coming from China. So anyway, lots of variety here. Where I see there could be potential for people to add to this or to expand this is that because we know who they traveled with, these people's papers may survive. So this may be a way to research around, I'm not so much interested in these people, I'm interested in this category, right? But this is a way of maybe, where you can sort of dig deeper, find these people's papers, and then maybe find out more about these individuals. So I kind of envision something that could kind of explode from here. And Benjamin is the one I know the most about and I've done the most research on, but I hope that there's like potential for more of this. And yeah, anyway, that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I probably took too much time.